welcome to our latest in our series of What If debates. And firstly, the usual housekeeping matters. You'll hopefully have seen the posters and flyers around the room with the Wi-Fi login instructions. For the tweeters among you, the hashtag is, as usual, #IOE Debates, all one word. And that's where our live stream audience can submit questions to the panel as well. And of course, again, as usual, we're not expecting a fire drill. So if the alarm sounds, do take the doors out behind you and we'll go out onto Bedford Way. And to the debate itself. Now, new technologies are revealing the inner workings of the brain like never before. Just a few months ago, we had reports of the development of neuropixel probes, thinner than human hair, that will enable the simultaneous measurement of hundreds of neurons across multiple brain regions. And meanwhile, we see the neurification of many fields, from law to economics, theology, and of course, education. And so at the present, we face the many exciting prospects that educational neuroscience seems to offer, but also warnings of falling prey to neuro-nonsense, one of the more polite terms used. And in that context, we wanted to take a step back and take a measured look at what we can usefully expect of neuroscience in terms of informing education policy and practice, and how we, whether as parents, carers, teachers, policymakers, academics, and so on, can avoid being drawn into neuro-snake oil. Perhaps also how we as a society should be attending to some of the ethical questions and developments in neuroscience that neuroscience could increasingly raise for us, not least in relation to intelligence and capacity for learning. So, to help us chart our way through the science and the conflicting messages that surround it, we have Professor Becky Allen, who is director of the IOE's new Centre for Education Improvement Science, which spans research in the fields of economics of education, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. Becky's own expertise is in the analysis of large quantitative data sets to address key questions in education policy and practice. In particular, how best we should measure school performance and how we can make teaching more effective and fulfilling. Becky, I'm glad to say, recently returned to the IOE after launching the Education Data Lab, and she's just been made chair of the DFE Review of Teacher Retention. Turning to Professor Stephen Rose, Emeritus Professor of Neuroscience at the Open University. Having trained in biochemistry and neurochemistry at Cambridge and London, Stephen subsequently focused on the neurobiology of learning and memory. But he's also been actively engaged with the ethical, legal, and social aspects of developments in science, especially genetics and neuroscience, working in collaboration with the feminist sociologist of science, Hilary Rose. They together founded the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science almost 50 years ago. Their most recent publication, the 2016 publication, Can Neuroscience Change Our Minds?, takes a skeptical look at some of the claims made for that field. And I'm delighted to say that Hilary also joins us this evening. Hopefully she'll have more to add once we've had our initial inputs from the panel. Then we have Dr. Catherine Sebastian, Cat as she likes to be known, reader in the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London, where she directs the Emotion, Development and Brain Lab. Catherine's an alumna of both UCL and Oxford, and her research focuses on the development of emotional processing and regulation in typically developing adolescents and in adolescents with antisocial behavior, using techniques from developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And then finally, we have Professor Michael Thomas, Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Birkbeck, University of London, from where he directs the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, a centre with which the IOE has got long-standing collaborations. And the Centre for Education Neuroscience is a cross-institutional research centre with UCL, and its USP is really advancing translational research between neuroscience and education and developing practical applications within the classroom. Michael also runs the Developmental Neurocognition Laboratory at Birkbeck, which examines the cognitive basis of cognitive variability, including intelligence and developmental disorders. Michael's also a chartered psychologist, fellow of the British Psychological Society, and fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. So you can see the esteem and knowledge that we represent here on the panel today, and we're really looking forward to hearing from them. And we'll start with Michael. Over to you, Michael.
Great, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here today. Thanks for that fantastic introduction. So I'm going to be quite pro the involvement of neuroscience in education, and I'll let everyone else disagree with me later. So the main reason we can learn is because our brains are plastic. So the general idea of involving neuroscience in education is that if we understand more about the neural mechanisms of learning, that may be helpful to teachers in some way. It's not the whole picture by any chance, but that's the central motivation. We shouldn't think that this is just about neuroscience in education. This is part of a multidisciplinary approach to the learning sciences, and it's a part of a dialogue between all the people who are involved in education, rather than neuroscientists in their white lab coats telling teachers how to do their job. But I want to start by giving you an intuitive feel about why understanding the brain may be helpful for teachers. And I'm going to present some what I take to be puzzling questions. So why is it that I can sometimes forget what the capital of Hungary is, but not that I'm afraid of spiders? Or why do I forget what the Pythagoras proof is, but not that I don't like flying? Why do I find that I've learned things better after a good night's sleep? If I get 7 out of 10 in a test, why would I be delighted if I was only expecting to get 5, but kind of miserable if I was expecting to get 9? I mean, isn't a 7 a 7? Why, as a teenager, did I start doing risky things just to impress my friends? Why does my mind go blank when I'm really nervous in an exam? Why do I learn a new language so much more easily when I'm 5 than when I'm 50? All of these are puzzling. The answers to those questions are to do with the particular history of the brain, how it has evolved, and how it develops. Now, Google are very good at designing machine learning. Okay, they've gone into Facebook and understand all about your social profiles and your consumer history. So we do understand quite a lot about how machines can learn, and we know that we can design learning machines that don't have any of those properties. They don't have to sleep, they don't have to forget, they don't have to get worse at learning as they get older, and they don't have to go through being a teenager. So all of these aspects of learning are specific to our particular biology and the particular way our brains work. So that is the central motivation for exploring, understanding how does it influence you when you're trying to learn with the brain you've got. Okay, so I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy to do this. One of the problems is learning in the brain is very complicated. So back of an envelope, there are at least 7 different systems that can learn in the brain that are interacting all the time over different time spans and with different forgetting curves that are differentially sensitive to motivation and emotions and so forth. So there's a lot going on there. When we're trying to translate from neuroscience to education, generally that's through interactions with psychology, we have to check that the basic science is far enough progressed. We really understand enough about how the brain works in order to say things to educators or policymakers. Then there's the challenge that we can understand more about learning, but learning only turns out to be one part of education. There are all sorts of other aspects of of education about how you design syllabuses, how you design your school systems, how you legislate for teachers, for teaching profession, and wider influences of society and the family environment. So it's a very complicated system altogether. Then even if we know how the brain works, that doesn't necessarily easily translate into giving advice to teachers about what might work better in the classroom. That's going to be an extended process and involve a lot of working with educators to take insights from neuroscience and translate them into useful hints and tips and things that might work in the classroom. And then teaching itself is often a skill that is delivered in the moment. So we have to ask ourselves, what do teachers actually need to know about how the brain works? So it's more of a skills acquisition. We need to maybe give general advice, a kind of user manual rather than a technical manual to teachers. I think the translation between neuroscience and education will work in two broad ways. One of those is a concept of, very broadly, brain health, that when children come into the classroom, they are ready to learn, they've had a good breakfast, they are physically fit, they are well rested. But also there will be aspects of neuroscience that will help us understand more about how you learn maths, or how you learn science, or how you learn to read, or how your socio-emotional skills develop so that you sit nicely in a classroom and can work in groups. There are, of course, a bunch of things you can get hung up on when you're trying to translate from neuroscience to education. We'll probably hear more about that during the course of this evening. Amongst them, neuromyths, so misunderstandings of what the science says. Maybe we'll hear more about that. The risks of commercialization, people trying to sell you brain training, take money off you and say it's endorsed by neuroscience. And sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what neuroscience is, the idea this is just about brain images, right? It's about colored blobs. Whereas actually neuroscience is many different methods to try and understand the neural mechanisms that underpin learning. So many challenges. It's an ambitious goal, but I think one worth pursuing. Thanks.
Michael, thank you so much. Becky.
Right, well, Michael's given a very, I think, positive view of what might be if we could have a better understanding of the brain. I'm going to talk about the now and what's some of the consequences of having an incomplete understanding of cognition for teachers and for teaching. So let's start with the obvious, the snake oil merchants that have been selling us hope that we can transform learning based on neuromyths. Brain gym, VAC learning styles. We still know there's high rates of endorsement of these ideas amongst teachers around the world. Of course, they thrive in environments where we have poor models of cognition, and yet I think we can refute them, and we have refuted them without good models of cognition, and that's what we've had to do. And we do it through straightforward empirical testing, the kind of widget testing that the Education Endowment Foundation has become so good at. Would having a better understanding of the brain alone be enough to stop this kind of stuff? I'm not so sure. I think we need something else as well. I think we need a much better ecological understanding of the teaching profession, of why they have the beliefs they have, why bad ideas persist in the profession, why the profession can be quite faddish in the way it likes to pick up new ideas and run with them, and also the practical ideas about how to bring knowledge to practitioners. And then the neuromyths I see really as some of the old fads. I think there's a current frontier of new ideas that are emerging in teaching practice, and I don't know whether they're going to get faddish or not. These are the changes that teachers are currently making, and they say they're making in the classroom based on teaching techniques that have been inspired by cognitive science. So they cite the work of Paul Kirchner, John Sweller, Dan Willingham when they talk about these things. They talk about introducing pre-testing effects, redundancy effects, goal-free effects, desirable difficulties into their practice. And what they say about this is they say, well, this is evidence-based theories, so this is good, this is scientific teaching practice. There's a problem with this. The evidence itself is incredibly thin in this area, And by thin, I mean there's relatively small numbers of small N studies at the moment. Often they're run on psychology undergraduates rather than on children that we teach, and they often focus on short-run outcomes rather than the long-run outcomes that teachers care about and society cares about. And when you're skating on thin empirical evidence, it's really dangerous when we don't have a strong confidence in our working theories of cognition. You see, the thing about theories is they help us generalize outside the specific case studies of the experiments themselves. And the thing about the classroom is that because of the diversity of the students that we teach and the diversity of the knowledge domains that we operate in and the diversity of the classrooms that we work in, we need theories, because without the theories we simply can't generalize. So, if we can learn more about how we learn, does this ever tell us how we should teach? To answer this question, I always like to go back to the New Zealand educator and professor, the late Graham Nuttall. And what he says about teaching is this. He says, teaching follows the standard patterns of a cultural ritual that has largely remained unchanged despite many attempts to reform it. So why should neuroscience reform it? He says our difficulty is, well, in order for a teacher to manage a class of 30 students, all of whom have different brains, different knowledge, skills, interests, motivations, teachers have to focus on the performance of the whole class, and it's impossible to focus on individual learning for anything more than very brief periods of time. And so because of this numbers problem when it comes to teaching, teachers are largely, a lot of the time, cut off from any kind of information about what students are learning. And I think this presents a bit of a challenge for how we incorporate ideas of cognition into the classroom. He says that teaching's like conducting an orchestra. So whilst I think we absolutely must do more to understand cognition, I'm less sure how or why it should lead to material changes in the daily practices of teachers.
Becky, thank you so much. Kat?
Thank you. So as Becky said in her very nice introduction, my research focuses on social and emotional processing during adolescence and how brain development may contribute to behaviour at this time of life. And I also look at aggressive behaviour. And I've always been quite passionate about communicating our research to educators, giving talks in schools, etc. And it's been really nice because teachers, in return, have been really passionate, usually about hearing what we have to say. And when I started my PhD about 10 years ago, there was a real sense of excitement about the possibility for neuroscience to directly influence what was going on in the classroom. And I think, as has been alluded to already, some of that early promise hasn't really come to fruition, and there have been problems with neuromyths and non-evidence-based products. Having said that, I thought I would lay out a few areas where I think neuroscience has, at the very least, had an indirect and positive influence on the way we think about young people. And I'm particularly going to focus on adolescence, as that's the time of life that I work on. So first of all, our knowledge of the adolescent brain and how it develops has really expanded enormously in the past 10 to 15 years. And I think this is also an example of a public engagement success story, since most people are now aware, I think, that the teenage brain is still a work in progress, and we don't just think of the teenage years in terms of hormones, for example. And there have been some practical applications. So, for example, evidence regarding shifting circadian rhythms in adolescence has led to the suggestion that the school day might start later for adolescents than for younger children. And there have been some trials of this that have had positive outcomes in terms of pupil well-being and academic achievement, albeit relatively small scale. And of course, there are practical issues that bump up against the theory from neuroscience. But I think improved understanding of teenage brain development has also given teachers a better understanding of why teenagers behave as they do. And this will, I think, have a subtle impact on how they interact and teach young people. So, for example, there's evidence that prefrontal cortex is one of the latest regions to mature, while functions of the brain dependent on this region, such as executive functions, so controlling our behavior, and high-level social cognition, these continue to develop into the late teens and early 20s. And there's also evidence from neuroscience that connectivity between regions of the brain involved in decision and emotion are particularly late to mature. And this sort of information has suggested that maybe this is why young people are capable of quite sophisticated risk-benefit analysis when in sort of cold conditions in the lab. But when they're in a peer context, this breaks down and they maybe take more risks. And so I would argue that as a result of this sort of research, there has been a shift in the way that educators understand and engage with this age group. And also, and I think this is quite important, in how young people understand their own development. Moving on to atypical development, so much of the work that I've done in this area has been focused on the neural mechanisms that underpin aggressive behaviour in children with conduct problems. And it's well known that this is a very varied group, so some children within this group aggress because they show callous behaviour, they lack empathy for others, whereas others have empathy and feel guilt when they have done wrong, but they lash out and have poor emotional control. And research by ourselves and others has shown that there are quite profound differences in the way the brains of these children are processing emotional information. And as a result, several educational interventions have been pioneered that are trying to tailor the intervention towards the particular child. So, for example, interventions aimed at children who have callous unemotional traits, so who lack guilt and empathy, will emphasize the rewards that they can gain from good behavior rather than punishment, and also the importance of gaining social approval, as opposed to, for example, restorative justice type techniques that may be less effective in these groups. However, you could say, and I think one counter-argument that is that I have some agreement with, is that we don't necessarily need research into the brain to gain these insights. Behavioral psychology studies could tell us all we need to know about adolescent emotional behavior and decision-making, or that some children with conduct problems will respond better to one approach than another. And yes, I do agree with this point, but I would argue that neuroscience plays an important role in actually motivating a lot of the behavioral work in this area. For example, adolescence was once a neglected area in psychology until neuroscientists discovered the extent of ongoing brain development, and this led to a renaissance in research on adolescence in the behavioral and educational domain. So what then would I say is the role that neuroscience plays in education? First, I would say, don't underestimate the role it could play in social and emotional aspects of learning. So mental health is increasingly on the educational agenda, and I think its influence here will only grow. Second, while a finding in the neuroscience lab may not directly translate into practice in the classroom, I think it does have positive influences in how teachers understand development and in how neuroscience informs more directly applied research. Therefore, I think there's still plenty to be gained by understanding more about how the brain learns and develops.
Kat, thank you so much. And Stephen?
Well, one of the things that, as a neuroscientist, I have recognized as time has gone on is if you work hand in hand with a sociologist, you tend to question a lot of your premises. And the premises which are embedded in the title, the very title of this debate, is what if we were able to say more about how the brain learns? And I should begin, therefore, by insisting that this is a fallacy. The fallacy is that it is not brains that learn, it is people, it is children who are learning, and the brain is embedded in those children. Those children are embedded in the society around us. So it's impossible, it is a philosophical fallacy called the mereological fallacy, to ascribe to a part of a system the properties that belong to the whole of the system. So it's not brains that learn, it's people that learn. Now, bearing that in mind, can we actually begin to think at all about what we can discover about brain processes which helps teachers teach better or children learn better? Michael began by asking a series of very interesting questions. Why do I forget? Why do I learn better after sleeping? Why are teenage behavior risky? Now, these are extremely interesting questions. They're interesting questions to me as a neuroscientist because I would like to investigate the brain processes that might be involved in them. The question we have to answer here, however, is whether those questions, answering those questions in terms of brain processes, will actually help the educational process, either for teachers or for children. And I'm a little skeptical about so far how far we've gone on this. Now, it's perfectly true that everyone on this panel has dismissed so far the neuromyths, the brain gyms, the VAC-styles learning and so on. But it's important to remember that a lot of those brain myths are actually what counted 10 or 20 or 30 years ago as good science, left brain, right brain dichotomies, which are still appear in the literature as good science, still a lot of teachers believe in, and yet are now sort of regarded as hopelessly oversimplified and irrelevant to the way understanding the way that the brain works. So neuromyths emerge not just out of nowhere, but out of past science or partially misunderstood science. And maybe the scientists themselves, us neuroscientists, have had some blame to carry for that. So let's focus on dismissing the neuromyths and come back to, as it were, within inside the tent of neuroscience and educational neuroscience. What might we be able to achieve? The question again I come to is, would it help to understand teenage risky behavior if we knew about the partial development and the slow development of the prefrontal cortex in the brain? Might it not be equally instructive to us in understanding teenage behavior if we studied the properties of the big toe? I mean, for teachers and for educational psychologists, it doesn't matter which bits of the brain are involved. What matters is understanding that teenagers at a certain age show risky behavior, and we need to find techniques in order to modulate or to, if you like, contain that behavior. The same argument applies to an awful lot of the claims that are being made by educational neuroscience at the moment. Michael, in one of the papers that he wrote, which is a very instructive paper predicting developments in the future of educational neuroscience, suggested that ultimately it might be necessary to genotype all individual children so that you might be able to, I thought you might want to come back to that, Michael, I'm sure you will. But the idea that you could actually decide from understanding the genotype, the gene sequences and the role of the genes in any individual child, how you could tailor specific education to that child seems to me to be not merely sort of a bridge too far, but probably at least a continent too far. We're not at that stage, and I don't think we ever will be at that stage. The danger with this is that it actually distracts from the things that we really do know, and several people, Michael included, pointed out that actually children who go to school starving and in poverty are not likely to be good learners. We don't need to know how the brain works to do that. We do need to do something about food banks and austerity. So I'm left very strongly with the view that the neuroscience has a lot of very exciting things to say about how the brain works, how the brain empowers and then enables education and learning to take place. But not much of what we are learning about how the brain learns, how we learn using our brains, is actually going to impinge usefully and directly on education of teachers or of teachers' education of children at the moment. And what we could do, however, is to recognize that teachers in their own teaching style, teachers studying more closely than perhaps many of us do in the laboratory, how actual children behave in the classroom, can tell a lot to neuroscientists about the directions in which that research ought to go. That leaves two other areas which may be of relevance here. One is the development of techniques supposedly to enhance learning. For example, techniques which have been experimentally tested called spaced learning. Again, this is something to do with comparable to the teenage sleep experiments that Kath was talking about. And the second is development of technologies whether they're pharmacological technologies. I don't know how many people in this audience have actually taken Ritalin or taken any of the supposedly learning enhancers and memory enhancing drugs. The evidence is that a quite significant number of people do, and the evidence from those drugs is that they do enhance attention and make certain forms of learning more possible and easier. More directly, and within the tent of neuroscience at the moment, there are development of technologies which involve direct current stimulation of the brain. You plant a set of electrodes across your head, you pass a 9-volt current across it, and out of that you're supposed to be able to do slightly better at maths learning tests than you were before. And there have been a couple of papers published from Oxford suggesting this as well. I think these techniques are probably in their primitive stage, but I can predict that we're going to see more of them more of them will turn out to be neuromyths as time goes on.
Thank you so much for those stimulating inputs. Let's thank the panelists audience. Well, I've certainly found that absolutely fascinating myself and learnt a lot, which is, of course, the purpose of these debates. It's really interesting that we've had such an array of different views from the potential for learning around brain health, about learning about how students learn in particular ways, risky behaviours and so on, to, of course, right across our panellists, thoughtful contributions about the risks here, about particularly risks of early adoption and fads, as Becky put it. And of course, really, it's been very insightful in terms of the interaction of different disciplines, how Kat's argument that neuroscience is driving research in cognitive psychology, but also the important interactions with the social sciences. And of course, for us as educationalists, the point has been made time and again that we need to be thinking about our educational contexts, the environment and systems in which we are expecting teachers to teach and students to learn. So I'm really keen to hear more. I guess Stephen raised the point about whether neuroscientists have done enough to counter the misuse of their findings by the neuro industry, or even having sort of promoted misinformation themselves. And I suppose this is the trouble, that when we're excited about our field of work, we may rush to conclude before the evidence is secure. I think that's what Becky was hinting at as well. Could I just put that to the panel? How even you at the end there, Stephen, were talking about some potentials, however sketchy, and some of them very dubious. But it seems from the contributions that there are some areas where we have something to learn here. But the general message is we mustn't rush to draw inferences from this work. What do we think is the sort of timeline? I imagine you have very different views about how soon teachers may be getting relevant and useful information in this area, or whether, as Stephen has hinted, actually we may be looking in the wrong place. And I'll just look at Michael and Kat to answer that question to start with.
Okay. Well, I think this is where initiatives like Becky's new centre are going to be really helpful, because I think, ultimately, any translational effect that neuroscientists do have will have to be evidence-based. And I think it's not just the timeline, but also the scale. So I think what needs to happen is that you need to start with small-scale trials and then build it up and have a real evidence-based approach to education in the same way that we do for evidence-based medicine, for example. As for the timeline, I think it really depends on the area that you're talking about. I think, as I said in my talk, there do need to be a lot of intervening stages between the neuroscience and the practice. And often I find when if I'm giving a talk in a school and, someone might ask me, which happens quite often, but what does this mean for what I can do in my classroom tomorrow? And actually, when people ask me that question, I feel like a fraud because I'm not a teacher, I'm not an educator, and I don't have the experience of what it means to work on the ground with young people on that day in, day out basis. So I think we really need, almost a new profession to try and sort of bridge that gap.
Thanks, Kat. Michael?
Oh yeah, as Kat says, we're aiming to have everything ready for teachers by Monday morning. So it's a tricky question. If you think about the analogy to public health, that how we treated people, doctors and healers, there was a big history of trial and error about what might make you feel better, and try rubbing that bit of bark on you, and cold compresses and that kind of thing. And that was accumulated experience over hundreds of years and passed down through generations. And sometime in the 19th century, the old Victorian gentlemen with their top hats said, I think we should start cutting up dead bodies to see how they work. And there were the emergence of natural sciences about chemistry and physics. How does biochemistry work? How do bodies work? All of that's basic science. There was no obvious cutting up dead bodies. How is that going to be relevant to healthcare? 200 years later, we have a public health system which is entirely based on scientific evidence-based understanding of how bodies work. That doesn't mean you all have been reduced to just like units of meat. We can still understand that health is a social concept. Doctors treat people, they don't treat bodies, but all of that is based on an evidence-informed scientific basis of understanding of biology. So that took 200 years. I'm hoping we can do it a bit quicker than that. But I'm well aware that there are these different time horizons. As researchers, we're thinking in terms of years to understand basic mechanisms, to build that evidence-based. I'm aware that policymakers have a time horizon of about 18 months before the education minister finds different employment. And I'm aware that teachers are looking for new techniques to use on Monday morning. So all of these, it's not scientists discover the answers and then present them when they're ready. It's about all working together to progress this, to build the evidence base. It'll take some time. I am aware that there are challenges that as a scientist I can sit there and stay in the lab, but policymakers are making decisions all the time. And I would rather they were informed by our current best reading of the literature than they were listening to other people who have no idea what's going on at all. So it's a tricky balancing act.
Thanks, Michael. Becky and Stephen, quick comments. Becky?
Well, I think when we have new ideas about how we might like things to be done in the classroom differently, I think we just have to recognise that things aren't introduced into a vacuum, and we already have the pre-existing practice that's out there. And we have to think through, firstly, kind of what's the disruption effect and the time investment that teachers need to make these changes. And then just what are the balances of risk? So to take the example you mentioned of spaced learning, something lots of teachers at the moment are being encouraged to think about, to reform their schemes of work and their curriculum, to get rid of the blocking that you traditionally have where you go through one part of the subject followed by another, and to introduce some elements of spaced learning. Now, it has a one-off disruption effect for the teacher in the way they have to reform the way that their curriculum is organised. But we don't think that spaced learning in itself is going to be something that's likely to be damaging, having done it. Yeah. And so if teachers want to give it a go, knowing at the moment we've got some evidence that's out there that it could be helpful, we've got some more trials ongoing that we're going to learn the outcomes of pretty soon, I think, from the EF. I would say if teachers were up for it and they wanted to spend their time doing it, knowing it's probably not going to be damaging to pupils, I would say go ahead and do it. And that's the only way we can proceed in things like this under a great deal of uncertainty about what's likely to work in your classroom.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Well, I think some of the timelines are very close. Some of those technologies are with us now, and they are going to be used whether we like it or not. People are going to try them. Some of the technologies, the one I was talking about, direct current stimulation, is now licensed for recreational use, at least in the United States. And you can buy the equipment in order to do it yourself, give yourself a brain electric shock and test yourself now. So the technologies are there. The question of whether they're efficacious or not, or should be adopted, is a different question. But my belief is that they are going to go and go and go in the same way as all sorts of things go fast, whether or not we as neuroscientists, and a refreshing degree of skepticism on this panel, I'm delighted to see, endorse them.
Thank you. Let's turn over to you, the audience, and as usual, we'll have questions in clusters, and if you can start by saying who you are. Also, the usual message, if we keep the questions and answers short and to the point, we'll be able to fit more in. So, hands from anyone interested. One here. Anyone else for the first set? One at the front. Thank you. Please.
My name is Patricia Charlton. It's a very interesting talk. Thank you. One of the questions that's emerging, and you've already touched on it, is the issue of mental health in education and anxiety and stress. So in this idea of the relationship of what we need assistance with in the teaching role, where could neuroscience help us to understand how to support students in this more emerging trend? It's becoming more and more heightened problem, I think, in education.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
And the question here?
That's a whole seven.
Mine's slightly more of a thought than a question, and I'm not sure I'm going to articulate it very well, but it's sort of following on from what we were just saying, that in terms of what, Steve, you were saying about neuromyths, and you used the example of the left and the right brain, and then I was thinking myself actually about medicine and how, you know, back in the Greek times, you had Hippocrates come along and say, oh, you know, it's imbalance of the four humours, and of course that wasn't correct, but it was switching the way we think so that it's not something external that was being projected onto our bodies, but something that was coming from internal. And that if we don't want to be too quick in saying, okay, well, these were mistakes we made. Yes, as neuroscientists, we do have to put the blame on our shoulders to some extent, but I don't think we should necessarily reject too quickly because, you know, like it is a progress. But I was wondering, Steve, if maybe you think that it might be different now because society is so different in terms of how quick things are moving, in terms of technology. Do we have to more quickly reject ideas and sort of try and speed up because society is so sped up compared to however long ago Hippocrates was around?
No, that's a really useful question. So I think we'll just ask Stephen, as the question was put to you, to answer that, and then we'll turn to the broader issue of mental health.
I think Hippocrates had quite a lot going for him because he was interested in balance and the understanding, therefore, that there isn't, as it were, a linear reductionist sort of pathway from X to Y, but you have to understand interaction and dynamic. And that's something which a lot of neuroscience and a lot of life sciences in general, and I think educational neuroscience as part of it, has tended to lose. So don't dismiss Hippocrates. As for speed, I mean, what is astonishing is the rate at which the neurotechnologies within the science itself are developing at the moment. The fact that you can use optogenetics to look at individual neurons and they're lighting up, so to speak, when an animal is trained on particular tasks is an extraordinary technological advance. And it's very difficult, even for someone who's right at the front of the field, to actually sort of predict where that's going to go in the next few years. How much of it will actually impact on educational technology is a different question. And that, as you've heard, I and several of the people on this panel are a little sceptical about.
And the question of mental health, you know, we hear about these trends and worries for younger and younger people, actually, that teachers are facing in the classroom and that local authorities are struggling to cope with. Does neuroscience have, you know, anything to offer classroom teachers in this regard?
I think it's your...
Okay, yes. So this is actually an area where I think when you're talking about the support that a young person needs directly, I think neuroscience actually isn't going to be that helpful. But that's not to say that it doesn't play an important role. So, you know, I think Stephen was saying earlier that, you know, young people are under increasing pressure, you know, that society is shifting, you know, there's, you know, greater child poverty, reliance on food banks, you know, student debt, exam stress. You know, I think young people are under enormous pressure, you know, problems at home, and really what is needed is, you know, resources to support those young people here and now. But I think neuroscience could play a role in, you know, shaping policy in terms of, you know, allocating resources. So, for example, we are learning a lot about, you know, factors that affect risk of mental ill health, factors that bolster young people and, you know, enable them to be resilient. We're learning a lot, for example, about how early life stress has a long-term impact on brain development, so that problems that you see early on in effects of maltreatment early on may not actually manifest until later. And so I think that the neuroscience can help us to understand the mechanisms that may help us to kind of understand what young people are going through, but actually when it comes to, you know, people on the ground supporting the young people, you know, I think psychologists, therapists, counsellors have effective techniques. I think there just aren't enough resources to support them.
Thank you very much. More questions? There's one here.
Thank you.
Sorry, right on the other side of the row. Please.
So last year I noticed that Professor Dylan William described cognitive load theory as the most important thing for teachers to know. That was the quote. And it strikes me as someone who's rather inexpert in these areas as an obvious area of importance for teachers. the relationship between working memory and long-term memory, the limitations of working memory, what that means for instructional forms, particularly for novice learners who have less relevant knowledge committed to long-term memory. So I guess my question is Dylan William right? Is it the most important thing for teachers to know?
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Becky on this one.
So I'll be interested to hear what the others say. I think there's like parts of cognitive load theory that are, we're pretty confident are absolutely right and that uncontroversial. And I think that teachers should undoubtedly have a good understanding of what working memory and long-term memory is and what they mean, and why there's likely to be variation within the classroom in working memory capacity across children within the classroom and the implications for that. I think that cognitive load theory gives teachers lots of really good steers that are unlikely to be wrong. For example, around how you should give kind of instructional advice and straightforward things so that they're not too cognitively demanding. So do I think it's the most important thing that teachers should be taught? I'm not so sure. In part because I just think that subject knowledge domains are really different to each other, and for some subjects, the idea of cognitive load theory and the importance of what it means for practice really resonates. And for teachers of other subjects, it doesn't at all. And that's not because of the cultural traditions of the subject, it's because of the very intrinsic thing that we're trying to change in the long-term memory and the things we have to go through to try and do it. So yes and no.
It's also absolutely fascinating how these sort of trends emerge, because I think the theories have been around for a very long time in terms of cognitive load. And then it's interesting to think from a social science perspective about the climate and the environment that suddenly allows these ideas to take off. It's fascinating, actually. Let's hear from our experts.
Back on that and just
Please.
say that I wonder if one reason why cognitive load is such an appealing focus is that there are very ready ways in which it can be implemented. And just thinking back to your what you were saying before about how certain things really take hold and become sort of maybe faddish. You know, maybe it's the ease with which you are able to implement them in the classroom.
And Dylan is a mathematician, and that is, you know, important in this.
Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to rank order for teachers what the most important thing is they should know. I think ideas like cognitive load or working memory, they are kind of like a soundbite that's useful for teachers. And, you know, there is debate in the neuroscience field about whether that there is a thing that is working memory. Indeed, we probably think that there are multiple systems in the brain that are maintaining information depending on the task you're doing. So if you don't take that neuroscience seriously, then you'll have this nice label that captures something about kids for you in the classroom. These are children who are, say, have working memory problems, so you know that you don't want to have long sets of instructions, they won't keep them in mind. If you ask them to repeat back a telephone number, they're going to forget that, or a sequence of moves on a board. But then if you think, oh, there's this thing called working memory, right? So why don't I just pay some money for one of these working memory training things? Then I should get better at everything. And an increasing amount of evidence shows that just doesn't work. In the brain, there isn't one thing that is working memory that you can train it and everything gets better. So I see it as a kind of a double-edged sword. We have these simple ideas that can capture important aspects of the children we see in front of us, but might lead us to have inappropriate expectations about how their behaviour can be changed through training.
Absolutely fascinating, thank you. And there was a question here.
Thank you. My name's Deborah. I'm a head of sixth form. And so I've got I think it's a selfish question and then a non-selfish question. My selfish question is there such a thing as dendritic meltdown, which is what I've heard about? And if so, I can't get my colleagues to believe me. And can you reference that for me now or later so I can go back to the teachers and just go, there it is, it was published? And my non-selfish question is, I have difficulty with students who are autistic, and they can appear quite rude, and they get themselves into a lot of trouble. And I think the numbers would back me up. If you look at a prison population, it's quite often that students who had difficulty learning or had SEN issues at school are more prevalent in a prison population. Could neuroscience help in the defence of these youngsters before they get to the state of exclusion, please?
Thank you very much. Now, I can't even pronounce whatever the phrase was about meltdown, so I'm turning to my expert colleagues to see if they have the answer.
Well, I'd like to turn the question back to you and say, what sort of help do you think neuroscience might give? How would neuroscience help you? What would be the optimum situation for that you could predict that you would like neuroscientists to be able to do to answer your question?
I'd like just to prove that being 16 and 17 is completely different to being 11.
I don't think you need neuroscience to do that.
Yes, or
you only have to be a parent or a grandparent to know that.
So on this point of dendritic meltdown, I've never heard the term, but there is evidence that synaptic pruning does occur very much during early development, but then also more recent research is suggesting also into the teenage years, and that this is part of the normal maturational trajectory for young people, but also may lead to there being certain sensitive periods for learning. I'm sure Michael can
But dendritic pruning or synaptic pruning is a fundamental process during development. The brain produces more neurons in its very early development, which are constantly cut away, and synapses are cut away. And the more the pruning takes place, the more efficacious the learning systems are within the brain, so far as current theory goes. Have a microphone.
This is Hilary coming in now. Hilary Rose.
Now, others elsewhere in the room and certainly on the behind the table talking to us may know more about this. But one of the studies that I dearly love is by Raina Rapp, and it's a group of neuroscientists and psychologists and teachers and students. And there's this marvelous conversation goes on between them in which someone says, I'm autistic, you can't talk to me like that, I need you to talk to me like this. And they actually, the youngsters themselves, have got a very substantial neuro-knowledge, and they actually use it in a way of actually, if you like, instructing their instructors how to make it work better. Now that seems to me a way that this panel is a bit sort of talking about what we do to them down there, and I think sort of empowering youngsters. There's one nice study I know of in this country in which the youngsters get hold of the knowledge very quickly, and they're pretty critical about it, more critical than many of the teachers, you know, and they're much more savvy. So I think much more dialogue, and that the public, perhaps, you should be engaging with, we should be engaging with, are the youngsters, particularly the teenagers. They're very sharp. And, you know, we ignore them at our peril.
No, that's a really helpful point. Thank you. Did anyone have any further input they wanted to make on the question about autism?
Well, a couple of points. Not specifically about autism, but I do know that in the States, at least, work on the adolescent brain, like by Lawrence Steinberg, has been instrumental in the courtroom system in mitigating the punishment that young people receive. So there are a few quite high-profile cases of youngsters who had actually been sentenced to death row, whose sentence was commuted as a result of...
We're not that bad.
But yeah, you know, so there is some input into the justice system from neuroscience. I also wanted to come back to Hillary's excellent point about especially teenagers really needing to sort of own this knowledge and engage with it. So I give quite a few talks to young people, and I think one of the dangers is, you know, if you say, oh, your prefrontal cortex is immature, that's very patronizing and can come across, you know, that you're talking down to them and saying that, look, you're not mature and you're not able to do this, that, and the other. I think actually the way I see it is that the way that we think about the developing brain is, you know, much more advanced than it used to be. You know, it used to be very derogatory, the way we talked about teenagers. Oh, you know, it's all hormones, you know, sensation seeking. And actually, the way that you engage with young people about issues such as how the brain develops, you know, how you engage in that dialogue really does shape whether they see it as a positive thing or whether they see it as just you talking down to them.
Thanks, Kat. I've got a Twitter poll response here. We tweeted out for IOE Debates who should be primarily responsible for calling out educational neuro-nonsense. And we had a list of potential people who would do the calling out. We had 37% thought the Department of Education should do it. 33%, just a third, thought the science community. Only 11% school leaders, which I think is fair, and 19% teacher trainers, which is really interesting compared to the response we had last week for responsibilities around good SEN education. And I actually think that initial teacher training has a great deal to offer here and that we should be taking that seriously, so that's very interesting. More questions from you. Sorry, can we have the... It's good for the live stream.
Yeah. Sorry, the students themselves and that you just mentioned, surely they should have some responsibility. Yes, I can learn this way, or no, I can't.
Yes, thank you. And one in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Nairi McNiven. I'm an MA student at the IOE. My question was for Michael. Whereas you did note that it's a multidisciplinary context into which this debate falls, I'm wondering what your thoughts are towards two lines of inquiry. Firstly, the implications of the distribution of resources or funding, as it were, or money being plowed into learning about how neuroscience affects learning, and wouldn't, or what are your thoughts on where or how the money might be better spent? And this is a question for the rest of the panelists as well. And secondly, how does this discourse apply where the relevant indicators have completely different meanings, let's say across states, across or within states, different parts of society, let alone, if I dare say, the global south and the global north, for instance?
That's really great. Thank you very much. So, two sides of a question there. First of all, where should the money be spent? Stephen?
She did ask Michael.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'm going to turn it to you, and then we can come to Michael.
Well, where should the money be spent? Anyone who is a working neuroscientist is likely to say, spend it on my research, spend it on more cognitive research if you're Michael, spend it on more molecular research if I was still working in the lab. But that's not a sensible answer. The answer, it seems to me, is that research money needs to go into the sharpest way of actually sort of alleviating the disconnect and the inequality in society, which is generating the problems that we're actually seeing. And that does involve, therefore, social research rather than biological or neurological research. So far as the educational neuroscience is concerned, I do think there's something to be said from the point of view of a neuroscientist as putting money into exploring the technologies and exploring the events that go on in the brain when an experimental subject, an animal, or even a child learns. And there are marvelously non-interventive techniques that you can use to actually explore that at the moment even with quite young children. And I think those sorts of approaches going forward within the field of neuroscience and learning theory within neuroscience have a lot to offer.
Thank you. Thank you. Michael?
So this is assuming I want to spend some money on research. Yeah, it's quite tricky because we deal with the historical system that we've got, which is often universities are split into disciplinary departments, and there are research councils focused on disciplines. And believe it or not, it's actually really hard to get research funds to do interdisciplinary work. Most of the research funding goes within disciplines, and it's just a historical accident about the way we have organized our universities, that they are organized around disciplines, but not around solving problems. So I would prefer there to be funding calls that are focused on problems and to allow the research scientists from multiple disciplines to organize themselves together to tackle problems. So for the funding system in an ideal world to be problem-solving oriented rather than favoring particular disciplines over other disciplines.
Thank you, Michael. And then the second part of the question was really about environments and the meaningfulness, I guess, in terms of neuroscience in different contexts. And I suppose even we tend to have this focus on typical and atypical and so on. What can Becky and Kat say something about applicability and any limitations or opportunities there?
I think maybe, sorry.
Yeah, please, Kat.
The way the question was phrased maybe suggests that, we need to take something from neuroscience and see how best it can be applied. But I wonder if maybe the best thing to do is to look at what are the biggest problems facing society and then see whether there's anything in neuroscience that can be applied to those. And also the question about the global north versus global south. Obviously, there are huge, differences that need to be taken into account. I think thinking about the great. I think thinking very broadly, I think the greatest issues that we face are things like, global literacy, mental health, things that have real predictive power for later well-being. So I would say probably focus resources there, and I think neuroscience does have a lot to say on both of those things. Obviously mental health is more my area. I think learning a lot about how context does shape the developing brain, whether that's a negative maltreatment environment, whether it's a positive nourishing environment. I think maybe that's a way that neuroscience could help those issues.
Thanks, Kat. And Becky?
I think it's easy to say that if we care about dealing and reducing inequalities in society, therefore we should be funding social research. And I'm not sure that's quite right. No. I think we see in education that so much of the inequalities between children and what they're able to achieve exist within the classroom. And one of the reasons they exist is that for whatever reason there's considerable variation in cognitive function of children sitting in the same classroom together. I think understanding what we should do about that as educators is something that neuroscience can make a huge contribution to. Trying to understand, for example, why some children are so much more sensitive to methods of instruction, of classroom instruction, than others are. I think these are areas that neuroscience can contribute to. And so I think that neuroscience can therefore make a substantive contribution to reducing inequalities in educational achievement.
Thanks, Becky. And you wanted to come in as well, Stephen.
I just wanted to pick up the north-south difference, because one of the things which is interesting, and it's a point that Michael made at the beginning, is that this is a historical study. Neuroscience is a historical science in a number of ways. It's also a science which is actually located in time, but not just in time, but also in space. It would be interesting to actually consider the concept of a teenager is a concept that arises at a particular time in a particular place in a particular developed society. Now, I'm not quite sure in the extreme poverty conditions of many of the situations in that we all know too well, whether there is such a thing as a teenager, and under those circumstances to worry about the teenage brain and, as it were, sort of needing to adjust school-going times, school opening times in order to deal with the sleepiness of a teenager seems to me to be a very specific and time and location-based application.
Really interesting, and I think that it's so important actually, this interface between neuroscience and social science, including education. We've had good conversations with Sarah Jane Blakemore about this as well. One of the things that I'm sitting here as chair thinking is, goodness, if I was sitting in the audience, I don't think I'd dare ask a question, because the terrain and the detail, the terminology often, and the science is so unfamiliar, I think. Often, some of you, of course, will be neuroeducation experts, but many of you won't be. What I really like to put to you, the audience, is perhaps especially to those of you who are involved in practice, whether that's practice with higher education students or practice with students in the classroom, is what would help you for neuroscience to be able to answer? What do you think are the burning questions here? Or are you just completely puzzled? And I've already got one hand up, and let's have exactly a few more. So, yes, colleague here. And then we had a couple on this side. We'll just hold on a sec. Sorry, I saw some hands on this side. Yes, the gentleman here and the lady at the front. Thank you. We'll come to you in a minute. So, starting this side.
Hi, my name's Caroline Macarini. I work for a tuition company. I hope I don't get any boos from teachers in the audience there. But I actually work in the education department, so trying to reform our practice. And actually one of the biggest things which we and our colleagues in schools who we work with find is these kind of pervasive kind of intergenerational ideas. And so I would love to hear the panel's view on how you think you could support parents to maybe understand that they haven't given their children bad maths, it's not a generational thing, and how actually you can sort of break a pattern that they see as unbreakable and engage them a bit more with potential and learning.
Thank you very much. And a question here.
Hi, I'm Shomitra Datta. I'm probably the only child psychiatrist here. My question is from the point of view of a practitioner. Could neuroscience have any contributions to quantifying intelligence and related concepts other than paper and pencil tests? Because particularly the tests are often, they're supposed not to change, and we need some measures which are change and shows us hope that educational interventions makes a difference or psychological interventions makes a difference. So any views for any of you in the panel?
Thank you very much. And then can you just pass the mic here?
Hello. I am a sort of music teacher type person, and I'm involved in an Education Endowment Foundation, an RSA research project up in the northeast. And I was particularly interested to hear you talking about the fact that it's children that learn, it's people that learn, rather than just looking at the brain in isolation. In the course of my work, I have come across people like Sally Goddard-Blythe, who does the reflexology and the movement, and the well-balanced child, and then Colwyn Trevarthen and Malak Trevarthen. Must I stop?
No, just
Get
speed
off.
it up. So get some
So I'd just like to know more about how neuroscience can get involved in following the benefits that one can see with the social interaction and the movement that goes on in a music class.
Thank you very much. Okay, 3 good questions there. So first of all, and I must say we've got about sort of 3 or 4 minutes, so if we can keep the answers short. First of all, who would like to answer on the intergenerational issue? Is that an indication there, Stephen? Or?
I was pointing to Michael.
Oh, Michael, then you've been volunteered.
So this gets us a little bit back to the notion of heritability of behavior and genes and things, which I don't want to really get into because that'll be a kind of deep issue. But we are born with different potentials, but we can all improve, and the best way to improve is to understand what personally for us is the best environment to spur us on. So there's plenty of scope, plenty of potential, and I think the biggest message that comes out of neuroscience or genetics or study of the brain is that our futures are not determined by our biology.
Thank you very much, and I think that's an important message. And it, of course, segues nicely onto the question about intelligence and interventions. Stephen, did you want to answer that?
I'm very sceptical, as some people will know, about the concept of intelligence per se as one reified lump of process within the brain or within the body or within the organism. This is a very, we keep emphasizing, and I think all of us on this panel actually agree with this, that the very dynamism of being a developing human being, and the way that intelligence, which can take many, many forms, it involves multiple brain processes, is shaped by that developmental interaction. You can't really split up the genes and environment and saying you're born with, I don't actually quite agree with Michael's formulation that you are born with a particular potential, but how you use it is if you like, environmentally contingent. From the very moment of conception, from the very moment pre-conception, you are simultaneously biosocial, you're simultaneously genetic and environmental. And untangling those is actually sort of it's really fool's gold to try to do that. What one's got to understand is the interactive processes. We've also got to understand the way that I think intelligence, what we call intelligent behavior, is going to vary from society to society, historically from time to time, and is also constantly being transformed by the very dramatic changes in the technologies within which we live. So we're shooting at a moving target all the time in this, and I think it's that concept, contracting properties, it's the concept of dynamism which I think needs to come into all of our discussions in these areas.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And did anyone have a contribution on the music question?
I guess just that this is actually quite a difficult question from an experimental point of view, because music is something that touches on so many processes and skills. So I'm aware of research showing that learning an instrument, you can actually see regions of the brain changing, that plasticity even in the adult brain is certainly there. And of course there's the evidence suggesting that playing an instrument can be protective later in life. But it could be learning the motor skill, it could be the social aspects, so it is actually quite difficult. But I don't know of any specific research on the social interaction element.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's been so interesting. I keep saying this because I just feel that personally I've learned so much this evening, and I hope that that's the same for most of those in the audience as well. I mean, one of the things that I think was revealed by that sort of the show of hands at the end is how much we, educationalists, have to learn even to just understand this terrain and this area. And this is something that I feel passionately that we at the UCL Institute of Education can do. We can be providing that bridge and that platform. UCL has the biggest concentration of neuroscientific research in the country going on here. Becky's new centre is going to be a key link both to cognitive psychology and to some of that neuroscientific work. And it's really important, I think, that we take a role in offering this resource of understanding and indeed facilitating these debates about the relevance, about ethics, about application in the classroom and so on. So I look forward to further debates in this area, and I hope that you will participate in those. In the meantime, thanks so much for your brilliant questions, but thanks particularly to the panel for an enormously stimulating evening. Please join me in thanking.